Okay, you guys should have gotten a notification that we're recording now. All right, so as a community, we've spent a lot of time discussing these career paths, facilitation methods and tools for integrating across boundaries. With this series we're kicking off today, we are excited and a little bit nervous to tackle really a critical question in our field, which is how do we assess and improve the outcomes of the boundary spanning methods we champion in team science? We know that this work takes a team effort, and today we begin exploring how we can know if those efforts are achieving their intended impact. So be sure to check out our website, and I'm going to put that link in here for the upcoming webinars. So check out our website for the upcoming webinars so that you can stay in the know with the upcoming webinars. And then you can also subscribe to our listserv if you would like to be the first to know, or among the first to know. Okay, so we've kicked off the series. We're excited to start today with and the series with two remarkable thought leaders in this field. So Dr. Joy Frechtling is a vice president at Westat. Trained in developmental psychology, her area of specialty is mixed method evaluation of educational programs, policies, and systems. Most recently, her research and evaluation work has addressed program implementation and outcomes across the pre-K, post-secondary level, with special attention to STEM education and the impacts of innovative efforts on traditionally underrepresented populations. She's also interested in how changes in programs and policies impact not only their immediate targets, but also the broader systems in which they are embedded. And not surprisingly, she never goes anywhere without a logic model. And then Dr. Christen Gajary is an independent consultant at Caspian Strategy and Analytics, LLC, and an adjunct faculty at The Ohio State University. Lisa began her career studying the role of reverse transcriptase in HIV-1 replication, and then moved to research administration, where she managed the translational and basic science space at an NCI-designed comprehensive cancer center. Her long-standing research interests include evaluating collaborative scientific endeavors and integrating computational simulation modeling in strategic management and strategy development. Lisa has worked with the Battelle Center for Science and Technology Policy, Clarivate, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and the National Science Foundation. And I just want to say that we are so thrilled that Drs. Frechtling and Gajary agreed to join us today. We were first clued into their important report from 2021, which is called Exploring Convergence Research, an initial examination of what it means and what it hopes to accomplish, by our own Interreach colleague, Marissa Rinkus, who I'm not sure if she's on the call. If she is, hi, Marissa, and thank you. One last thing before we dive into today's keynote, a few quick housekeeping notes. We encourage you to go ahead and use the chat to ask questions and share your thoughts throughout the presentation. And then there's going to be a few minutes for questions after Joy speaks, and then more time for more questions at the end after Lisa speaks. So those will be the opportunity to have a little bit more of a discussion. Okay, without further ado, let's get started. Dr. Frechtling and Dr. Gajary, the virtual stage is yours.
Okay, can you see my screen? Okay, that's the hardest part of any presentation. I feel really good now. Okay, it is really fun to be here to talk to you about this work that we did in 2021. Starting to talk with NSF and talk with colleagues about what this thing called Convergence Research is. It was emerging as a challenging and exciting kind of research then, but what the it is was a little bit mysterious, and certainly how to measure it raised challenges. So we're going to share with you some information about what we learned, what questions were raised, what questions it makes for research, and what your thoughts are on it. So this draws from National Science Foundation work that we did in 2021 it looks at three sort of themes. What is this thing called convergence research? What do you need to know about how to make it work? And then how do you know if it's worth it? How do you know if it's successful? By the way, we don't have all the answers. Okay, this is a picture of our team. And it was kind of interesting because we were kind of a mini team science, mini convergence experiment in doing this. As a team, we had never worked together before. Maybe certainly the Westat folks, we had worked with each other, but I didn't know Lisa from anybody, and Dean Avasius there. I don't know if you know Dean. He had been a program officer, and then he left at NSF, and then he left and went back to academia, and then he went back to NSF before we even finished the work. But it was fun and challenging, not only doing the work, but doing it together, because we really did bring different ideas and different perspectives. Okay, Christen mentioned the report we did for NSF. That's on the left-hand side here, exploring convergence research. And then we did have a publication in 2024 in Minerva, which was talking about the kinds of things that we did in the study and pushing it a little bit further in terms of research implications. All right, let's start with the basics, defining convergence research. We looked at this thing called convergence research from kind of 3 points of view. The foundations, what does this build on? What is this thing? How is it defined? Theory and practice, going from definition to looking at examples. What are things that are calling themselves convergence research? And then the idea of measuring success. Here we're thinking about what are some of the indicators, measures, questions to ask about success? And what does success really mean for a complex, multifaceted enterprise like convergence research? This screen shows our interactive methodology. We really relied on 3 kinds of data sources to explore convergence and get a better understanding. Being good little researchers, we started with a literature review. What have different strands of thought said about convergence research? How has it been defined? How do we look? What can the literature tell us? Then we looked at interviews. We did interviews with NSF program staff, others involved in convergence, to see through the eyes of those who were engaged in it, what it was, how it was defined, what were some definitions, what were practices, and what was success. And then as a third data source, we did some bibliometric analysis, looking at what publications and knowledge sharing devices have communicated about convergence research and what it involves. And these 3 streams were really kind of done in parallel. There was a lot of interaction among the methodologies and revision of methodologies as we were on our learning journey and sharpening our questions and raising new questions. So, what do we think we learned? We learned that convergence research is kind of a different beast. It's not simply a rearrangement of old things, ways of organizing things. And we pulled here a couple of quotes from some of the foundational literature that talks about convergence research and defines it. The National Research Council said convergence research is merging ideas, approaches, technologies from widely diverse fields of knowledge at a high level of integration. It requires an open and inclusive culture and to move beyond a single language. Handbook of Science and Technology. Convergence is defined as the escalating and transformative interactions among seemingly different disciplines, technologies, communities, domains of human activity to achieve mutual compatibility, synergism, and integration. I think those definitions are a little bit intimidating. And they're certainly intimidating when you come to measuring success, but that's the starting place. So we came out with kind of 3 themes that convergence research in the literature and the foundational activities talked about. It's use inspired, it's trying to solve a problem, and it's bringing novel frameworks to catalyze discovery and innovation. Use inspired, trying to solve a problem, trying to look at things differently. Convergence research is conducted by heterogeneous teams. These teams consist of people with diverse backgrounds, and important to note, often conflicting worldviews and perspectives, skills, competencies, capabilities, and values. I've always been amused by recognizing that people have got different groups of God-given values, and they are God-given, they are believed in thoroughly. Unfortunately, or fortunately, they're different. And resolving them is both an exciting activity or a challenge, and sometimes it doesn't work. Finally, these individuals work in contexts, and it's important in understanding convergence research and in looking at its success to think about the alliances, the organizations and communities that affects what happens in the teams, what happens to the researchers, and how these in turn are affected by the convergence experience. In our interviews, respondents emphasized a number of concepts that reflect the kind of foundational thinking that we found in the research. Co-creating, deep integration, very important up there in kind of the upper left-hand corner, a step beyond multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, going to transdisciplinary, creating something new out of existing things, thinking in bigger ways, real world problems, going beyond the academic stakeholder, going beyond the researcher stakeholder, and supporting and training new researchers. How do you get from here to there in terms of people understanding what it is they need to do and how they need to do it? Again, it's not a rearrangement of old ways, a cobbling together of different pieces. It's an emergent phenomena, revising the nature and purpose of basic research. Okay, I'm going to stop here and see, are there any questions about what the foundational literature and our informants told us? Christen, if you see any comments in the chat, let me know, because I can't see it very well.
Will do.
Any questions? Okay.
There is one question that just popped into the chat, which is, was deep integration defined?
That's a very good question. my takeaway was that it was defined by some of the other phrases that you saw on that slide. If I bringing perspectives together, bringing people together, going beyond interdisciplinary to new kinds of transdisciplinary relationships and thinking. So it was really kind of a summary phrase for pulling together some of these other sound bites that we showed you earlier.
And then we're just getting a flurry of questions, all on the same question, which is, can you just talk a little bit about the difference between convergence and transdisciplinarity?
No, I can't. Because let me toss out a few things, and you can see if you agree with me or not. I mean, I think one of the key features of convergence is its use orientation. And you can certainly have transdisciplinary types of teams and transdisciplinary interactions in situations where you're not aiming to solve a practical problem and change society in different ways. I would posit, but I'm open to challenge on it, that in convergence, the heterogeneity goes beyond transdisciplinarity. It goes into job roles. It goes into beliefs. It goes beyond, I would say, discipline, into other aspects of how we see ourselves in the world and how we create our values. So that would be my best shot at this point in time.
I see, Lisa, you unmuted. Did you want to add anything more to that?
I think I will touch on some of that in what I have here, and then so I'll just let you continue with the questions, and then we could go forward. Or
perfect. And I think so the only other question that's new here, or maybe a couple, maybe like thoughts on the relationship between convergence research and team science.
I'm sorry, what was the beginning of the question?
What are your thoughts on the relationship between?
They're certainly kissing cousins, if not closer, because team science is certainly at the heart of how you do convergence research. And maybe this is where, Christen, I'll give a plug for that new discussion that comes out. I just got an email last night from Gabriel Bammer talking about some new work by Michael O'Rourke and a couple of colleagues, where they talk about what they did in terms of teaching team science to support NSF's convergence projects. So I would say, that without team science, convergence wouldn't have a chance. So I'm going to stop on that high note and turn it over to Lisa now to talk a little bit more about finishing our initial exploration with bibliometrics, and then talking about some of the research questions. Then Lisa will talk it back to me, where I get back to the love of my life, logic models, and talk about success. So Lisa, take it.
great, thank you, Joy. So if we can maybe scroll back a couple slides there, if you don't mind. And so these questions that are being brought forward at this point are great, because they are really what the force of what we were trying to do and accomplish in this project. So getting at the ontological issues of what really is convergence research. If you look beyond, if you're just mining and looking for convergence research as a term of art when we investigated it. You just didn't come up with too much. And so you could do the next slide, Joy. Is what we did is we wanted to go more broad and see how bibliometrics could deliver for us, insights into how to understand the broad structure of convergence research, digging into those ontologies and those epistemologies of what convergence research is and how do we know it when we see it. And to see what topics were found within convergence research. And if you, so this is the broad map, and I just noticed like that, within this audience, a number of you are dots on this map, studying some of the literature. If you go to the next slide, just to give our general approach to the bibliometrics, we started with, we seeded this landscape using what Joy termed the foundational literature. And that involved a lot of the white papers on convergence research, a lot of the early work by Rocco and Bainbridge and others. And what we did is scrape some of those references and did a forward-backward cycling algorithm. And through that, we got the co-citing and the co-cited literature, and began to expand that. And we went through those lists, and we sitting down with a team of experts like Dr. Mishra and
Oh, Lisa, you're muted. I think the last thing we heard was that you were talking about Dr. Mishra.
Dr. Mishra, yes. Shalini Mishra, and also Dina Vasius, and began to take that list and to really hone that list on the important literatures that were antecedent to and essential to our understanding of what we call convergence research, and to try to come out closer of the question, of convergence research as a term of art. Is it distinctive? How does it differ from transdisciplinarity? How does it differ from other aspirational use-inspired research? How does it differ from team science? All the questions that were asked. If you go to the next slide, you won't be surprised to see this, right? Given your questions, right? That a large, out of the five major domains that we discovered, that, a large proportion of them involved research on transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and cross-disciplinary research. And also on the green, you can see with scientific and research collaboration. And Joy, the next slide, please. Blue, right. So, and this is, in the red where you find the team size, blue where a lot of the bibliometric analyses are. Central within this cluster, you find the literatures on innovation and use-inspired research. And then again, one more advancement, please. In the yellow and purple, you find the literature on virtual and remote teams, which actually surprised us some of the connections that we found there, and then is particularly as associated with nanotechnology, the socially responsible innovation literature. So this is what our map emerged as, and from these literatures and there were over 2,000 works here. We began to develop and hone and try to gain a deeper understanding and a way to kind of conceptualize convergence research. And with respect to those questions of like, how do we know what it means to do convergence research? And how do we know when we're attaining those outcomes that we desire from convergence research? So the next slide, please, Joy. So what we came up with is that to begin to understand convergence research and to begin to conceptualize it in a way that's meaningful in terms of answering those questions of like, how do we do it and how do we know it's successful? Those questions. We began to think about convergence research as not just a system, a complex system, which Bainbridge and Rocco brought all those elements of complex systems into the understanding of convergence research. But broadly, would it help our lens if we considered it as a system of systems? And when we're thinking about, in particular, and how the literature discusses systems of inquiry, contextual systems, and collaboration systems, and I'll go into those in a moment here. But we sought to look at these, what we saw essential but ancillary systems to convergence research, and to look at these interactions and to begin to think of research questions from these interactions with one another. And not only the interactions of these systems as they're defined with one another, but also looking at levels of analysis within that. And so how do we begin to ask questions that is more ontologically attuned to what we think convergence research is? So can we have the next slide, please? So this led to our Minerva paper, and the research agenda that we put forward is to understand convergence research as a system of systems. What does that really mean? Is that just trying to, overlay a systems idea onto convergence research? Or does it have implications for how we ask questions, how we ask research questions going forward? So if you go to the next slide, please, was what we called inquiry systems. We understood that what convergence research needs to do is it has to overcome those hurdles, for example, of incommensurability between researchers in order to arrive at a shared and original innovative product. And so what needs to be done, there's a general understanding broadly within the literature that the focus ought to be on, when we talk about convergence research, on use-inspired work. We want to those elements that this series is focused on deep integration of knowledge, skills, and also values. Not only thinking about integration that way, but also thinking about integration of communities, communities of practice, and those with shared interests, and how new epistemologies, new methodologies, and methods emerge from those interactions. And then what has been brought forward most prominently in Rocco's work are cycles of convergence and then divergence within a process. And so, for example, then, Joy, would you go to the next slide then? Some of the questions that we have here as examples of research questions that are aligned to that on a level of analysis, if you think of it as at an institutional level where you are capturing those interactions of the research teams and researchers, and if you're trying to broaden up your scope to that level of analysis, one question that might serve to advance an understanding of convergence research, for example, is what are boundary objects in instilling and enhancing shared intellectual vision of convergence research. So what does that mean in terms of establishing boundary objects in convergence research? And then for the next slide, please, going down to the research team level, right? And thinking about that level of analysis and thinking about how, for example, at the research team level and the team science level, how do having cross-disciplinary spaces, how can they be created to embrace multiple points of view, multiple ways of knowing, multiple practices and sources of information, and how are those embedded within those institutions, and how are they, and how do those institutions and researchers engage with that and facilitate the development of those spaces. And then finally, for at the researcher level, the individual level, is thinking about how can at an individual level for that researcher to access those cross-disciplinary spaces. What does that mean for that individual to encounter those spaces and encounter those ways of knowing? And so what can be done to understand how that happens, and what can be done to understand how we can facilitate that at that level? And then for the next system, or we described as the collaboration systems, and we just know that that there is diversity within teams of researchers that engage in convergence research by definition within the foundational literature. And so the focus then within this space is how do we set the stage for success, the understandings that emerge from a broader literature. When you're talking about collaboration systems, you can focus on what does it mean to succeed at cross-disciplinary integration, and what does it mean to have inclusivity. Those questions of leadership, how does leadership become shared, and different types of leadership, and different levels of expertise within those types of leadership. And so how does it work when traditional boundaries are blurred and hierarchies are upended and flattened? And then, what does the team science literature as a whole, all of that, the richness from that literature, what does that bring into understanding collaboration systems? And for convergence research, for the next slide, what that means on a broader, like institutional level of analysis, some of the questions that can be approached to understand that better, or what factors enhance an institutional's flexibility to adapt successfully to these different task contents. And then on the that I read for the research team level, but this right, okay, you're right. So yes, so what factors for the research team? What do we have to do to have those research teams interact with one another? And by the way, so for these diagrams, just to show you this, I mean, what we were trying to do by having this ornate diagram here is to show not only to attend to not only the interactions between these three ancillary systems that we defined, but also to account for levels of analysis. And those references, those letters, are references to papers that that were influential in deriving these questions. So these are exemplar questions. And if we go to the next level, then to the researcher level, right? We thinking about the convergence research on the individual level. What does that look like in terms of long-term engagement and team outcomes, engagement with their fellow teammates over time, because it's a protracted process to engage in convergence research. And so what can be done to understand how that influences the researcher, and how the researcher then interfaces with that over time, and to bring in that dimension of time. And then finally, looking at these, what we call contextual systems, and what we mean broadly are, and what we focus most on are institutions of higher research and higher education research, and these funding systems that are typically trend toward siloed environment, that are recalcitrant in the sense that they are resistant to integration, and what we want to focus on in terms of like what we want to understand in order to set the stage for success is understanding how these novel institutional and organizational partnerships not only form but thrive over time, and what kinds of incentives and reward structures are relevant to convergence research. And then what influences are on the structures of departments and engaging in cross-disciplinary research, and how does that affect our understanding of convergence research and the practice of convergence research. And along those lines, questions then of that are a part of our agenda on the broader level is like, for example, or how can research institutions cultivate and promote an understanding of different methodological frameworks, different data types? How can that be done? And understanding sort of the logics too at that institutional level, and what can be done for in terms of institutions bringing that to bear on convergence research. And for the next slide, on the research team level, is one question is like, what strategies would foster inclusive intellectual and team cultures? And to think about that, we understand that to be something that is held up as a value in convergence research. And so what can teams do to do that? And how can we understand that better? And finally, looking at an agenda on a researcher level who's engaged within convergence research is thinking about how researchers come into convergence research and what, for example, can doctoral research programs be designed to do when they're targeting that individual researcher as a potential candidate for convergence research. So these are exemplar questions that emerge from this deep dive into a variety of different literatures about convergence research. And so Joy, for you, the next slide. So Joy is going to discuss now some hints and some insights that we gleaned about what it might mean to measure success and for convergence research.
Oh, Joy, you're muted.
Thank you. I don't know how I got muted, but there I was. Okay. So I wanna start with just kind of making a distinction between what Lisa's been talking about with regard to measurement and what I'm talking about. In my mind, what Lisa has been talking about is how do you know if you're doing convergence research? I mean, what is it that you have to ask about in terms of creating environments that have the characteristics that we found in the literature to characterize successful, effective convergence research? When we turn to talk about measuring success, and I talk about measuring success, we're changing focus a little bit. What we're talking about is, so you do all these things, so what? You have a great team, but your hypothesis is, if you go back to some of the early slides, that by doing things in convergence, you're going to get a better product. You're going to get a more innovative idea. You're going to get something that works better and solves things better. So the question about measuring success here is sort of saying, is it all worth it? Are you getting a different product? Are you getting a different outcome? We know that doing team science and doing convergence research can be very challenging, very, very demanding. So an important question is, so what? Do you really get the outcomes, the value added outcomes that you're hoping for? This is a work in progress. Like any of you who work in complex systems change, things that are innovation, measuring outcomes at that level is a challenge. In looking at the literature and then in talking about people, we saw hypothesized as outcomes a lot of traditional measures, bibliometrics analyses, measures of research and outputs and citations. But in the literature, we saw a paucity of clearly defined indicators of success in creating complex systems and leveraging them to reach the outcomes that are desired. When we talked with people engaged in the field, we again got more traditional measures of progress on milestones, on implementation, on establishing relationships and creating agreements. Again, in the longer term, we heard about patents, patent applications, multidisciplinary promotion, publications, and producing new knowledge, putting products into practice, creating new fields of research, and of course, additional funding. These are all valid and good measures of progress. But what we were hearing about at the time, and I would really be curious to know from those of you who are engaged in team science and in these enterprises, what kind of progress that you've seen in getting beyond these traditional kinds of outcomes to really get to, are we achieving the innovation, the different kinds of outcomes, the value added that convergence is hypothesized to achieve? One of the things that we tried to do at the end of this work that we did for NSF was take everything that we have talked about so far and create a logic model that builds on the what questions, the how do you do it questions that Lisa talked about, and the indicators that we got from our interviews, and the looking at the literature to say, if you were trying to track over time the success of a project, of a convergence project, what would you look at? What would you measure? And here we talk about some things that you would measure in each of the systems. To what extent, for instance, in inquiry, do you have joint problem formulation? To what extent in the activities are you seeing evidence of diverse stakeholder needs? If you look at the institutional context, again, this is in terms of activities, are you seeing an attempt to understand and break down departmental boundaries, identify issues in the reward system, create new kinds of resources and researcher development? Those are the things that need to be built into the activity. And then here we go into, in the short term, are you beginning to see evidence that joint problem formation is taking place? Not just that they are trying to do it, but that the product is different. It's a product that comes out taking into account these different aspects of inquiry and the different perspectives. Is the problem stated differently? When you look at team and team functions, one of the challenges that's outlined at the beginning is people speak different languages. They have different ways of formulating things. Do you see the team and do you see the research starting to develop a shared language? Are they able to change traditional hierarchies of leadership and followership to have cross-partner leadership? So these are early indicators that one would want to look at to see if the work is on the right track. As you move along, this is where you see the outputs and the outcomes of the three systems, inquiry, collaboration, and context, start to produce something different. An innovative product, a different kind of team, new organizational goals and functions. These are high-level descriptions of the kinds of things you would like to see. What remains a challenge, and what we had offered up to NSF as next steps, is to try and operationalize how one would go about measuring these things. How do you measure whether it's an innovative product? How do you measure whether organizational beliefs and constraints are changing? In some of these areas, there is definitely a lot to build on. In others, there's a lot more work to do. And then finally, in the long term, you've got expansion, continued development of ideas, continued benefits to society. You've got transformation, the emergence of new ideas, and you've got institutional change where the ideas really create a new way of doing things at the institutional level and at creating and sustaining policies that support convergence and a new way of problem solving. So we laid this out as a challenge to people. If you're going to look at success, think about what needs to be looked at in the long term, in the shorter and longer term, and more important, to go beyond some of these ideas that are highly defined, to say what would really be evidence that this is occurring and that you're having a change. There we are. So has someone solved these problems yet? Oh my gosh, I see 36 questions in the chat. Christen, how do you want to go?
Well,
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Lisa.
No, you know what? One of the things I wanted to sort of ask broadly, maybe with the chat and Joy as well too, is this thing. So Dr. Larson, Bethany brought up this idea of as convergence research as a changing frame in which to view research, right? And sort of the historicity of that choice and things that are embedded within that. And I saw somebody else that commented something that convergence research is not so much maybe a change of frame in as much as it's a different dimension to be measured. And I thought that was intriguing as well. So I was just curious to hear too from thoughts and about the distinctions between is frame versus dimension. Is it a frame, and does that matter? And why does that matter? Like, why does that matter in terms of measuring success? Joy, do you have any ideas?
No, you're asking me?
Yeah, I am asking you. And anybody else, really.
I would like to see the people who put those thoughts in the chat reflect a little bit on what they think.
I know there's been a really just a hot discussion happening in the chat.
I know, there's a lot.
So I've been maybe guilty of instigating that hot discussion to some extent. So let me just quickly and maybe shortly say, is there a cost? I haven't heard any of the trade-offs, right? If we talk about convergence research, we're not talking about something else. And people in the chat seem to, not everyone agrees with me, and that's okay. But I would love to hear you reflect in elevating convergence research. What are we missing, if anything?
I think that is a very good question, because there can be a tendency if it is just merely a frame without a reason for being. Does that in effect, like for other valuable types of research that are akin but maybe not quite described as convergence research, and how does that detract from the costs of limited resources for scientific advancement? And I think that's something that there's a lot within that. But one thing that I do think, though, is that what convergence research does a call to attention to is that the idea of complexity that's embedded within these systems, and the idea of innovation as emergence, and thinking about research on a systems-wide level in a sense that we're thinking about how to create environments and how to facilitate interactions that have enough structure, but provide enough wiggle room in such a way that there is that there are these opportunities for recombining ideas and bringing forward ideas. And I think that is essential and that is important. And I think convergence research has brought that forward. And so thinking about points and playgrounds for serendipity. How do we do that for science? How do we engage with that? And so
let me jump in here also, Lisa. I think that's why measuring success is so important. I mean, not just whether you do it, but whether it makes any difference. Complexity for complexity's sake is really not a goal. And you need to know what the value added is. But the other thing I want to add on it is every problem doesn't need convergence research. And the fact that you're not doing convergence research shouldn't denigrate what you're doing. In some cases, a simpler approach, a more straight approach, a more traditional approach is on the right path for solving the problem that you're dealing with. So that while convergence may sound very sexy and because it has all these complications, it still has to be proven. Amanda, you have your hand up. Do you want to? I don't know. Can someone unmute? Yeah.
Looking for the mute. Yeah, I really appreciated the logic model here. It's exciting. We're actually, for the first time, doing quite a bit in thinking about what, for various reasons, we're calling team science at the US Geological Survey. But I think that in terms of this definition piece, I don't care what we call a lot of these things. I think what I'm more interested in is the things that you have in the logic model, which is to really think about what are the aspects of these projects and how do we know that those aspects of those projects are working? And at USGS, some of the things we're starting to think about, for me, I divide them into the intellectual success. A lot of that's around the interdisciplinary coordination. Some of the stuff you're thinking about with the creativity, people coming together around a shared vision. Sometimes that's a boundary object. Sometimes it's a conceptual model. The interpersonal, a lot of that's in the team science stuff. A lot of that goes way back before team science to organizational behavior. And then there's also this logistical piece that we're really thinking about within our agency because there's a lot of silos. And, that's also something that team science has some stuff to say about, but it also goes to just very nuts and bolts kind of project management. What are the contracts like? What are the, so I think for me, yes, the definitions are real, but what we're trying to do is really break down like, okay, what are the aspects that makes it challenging? And then what are the, what capacities do we need to develop in our PIs and our earlier career people? And then you've really added to my thinking on how we measure that. And we're not quite to the measuring it point. We're at the point where our leadership is really prioritizing this. But yeah, thank you for your talk today. And I'd also, for everybody in that sort of discussion in the chat, I'd be really interested in thinking more about this definition at some point in the future. I mentioned that to Christine, that maybe we could have more of a definitional discussion at some point. So thank you all.
I think Amanda has her hand up.
Oh, that was Amanda. But I did see Jenny's hand was up. I don't know if Jenny, you still want to ask your question. We've got about 1 minute left.
Hi, no, Amanda actually kind of hit it more on the nail than I could have. So thank you.
Great. Okay. Any other questions before we jump off today? There's been such an incredible discussion in the chat, and it sounds like there's some interest in potentially exploring this a more systematic definition. But I just want to say thank you again to our speakers, Joy and Lisa. You guys have really just inspired us today, and we're really looking forward to the rest of the series this year. And Joy and Lisa, we'd love to have you back to join us and continue the conversation. And for the rest of you, please stay tuned for updates about the rest of our series, either in your inbox through the listserv, or you can check our website, interreach.org.
Thank you very much for inviting us to re-enjoy the experience of having worked on this study. It was fascinating, and if anyone wants to chat more, let's do it.
Excellent. Thank you. And yes, we did enjoy you. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye,
Great, thank you.
everyone.